Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the ultimate architect of absolute power, a monarch who transformed France into the cultural and military center of the universe. Yet beneath the shimmering gold of Versailles and the thunder of his victorious cannons lay a financial abyss that would eventually swallow the French monarchy whole. This is the story of the Sun King's bankruptcy, a $2 trillion luxury trap where the pursuit of incomparable prestige and non-stop territorial expansion created a debt so gargantuan and systemic that it set the stage for the most violent revolution in human history. We are not just talking about a budget deficit. We are talking about the financial strangulation of a nation, where the cost of maintaining the image of an omnipotent king became a terminal illness for the state's treasury. Louis XIV famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state. But by the end of his 72-year reign, he was a state that was functionally insolvent, a superpower that had traded its future for the cold, hard brilliance of a hall of mirrors. The engine of this destruction was the unprecedented cost of Versailles, a project that began as a humble hunting lodge and evolved into the most expensive and complex royal residence ever built. It was not merely a palace. It was a financial weapon designed to domesticate the French nobility, forcing them to spend their fortunes on courtly rituals and fashion so they would be too impoverished to rebel. However, this weapon backfired spectacularly. The construction and maintenance of Versailles consumed an estimated 10 to 25% of the entire national budget every year, a staggering figure that drained the treasury of the capital needed for industrial growth. Every fountain, every marble statue, and every gold-leafed molding was paid for with taxes squeezed from the peasantry, creating a lethal disconnect between the opulence of the court and the misery of the country. How could a king continue to build such a monument to excess while his people were dying of hunger in the streets of Paris? The answer lies in a complex system of shadow accounting that hid the true depth of the royal debt from even the king's own advisors. This luxury trap was compounded by Louis XIV's insatiable appetite for war. For more than half of his long reign, France was at war with almost every major power in Europe, from the Dutch Republic to the Holy Roman Empire and Great Britain. These were not defensive wars. They were wars of glory and territorial rectification that required the largest standing army Europe had seen since the Roman Empire. The financial strain was astronomical. By the late 1680s, the military budget alone consumed over 75% of the state's revenue, forcing the king's brilliant finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, to invent increasingly desperate ways to raise cash. Colbertism, which was intended to build French industry through state protection, instead became a tax extraction machine where every productive sector of society was milked to pay for the king's muskets and fortresses. The most damaging financial maneuver was the sale of royal offices. To generate immediate cash, the crown began selling government positions, titles of nobility, and even the right to collect taxes to wealthy commoners. This created a bloated, corrupt bureaucracy where thousands of officials were more interested in recouping their initial investment through bribes and embezzlement than in actually serving the state. More importantly, these offices carried tax exemptions, meaning that as the king sold more positions to raise money, he was simultaneously shrinking his own tax base for the future. The wealthiest and most capable members of the middle class were buying their way out of paying taxes, leaving the entire burden of the king's debt on the shoulders of the poor. This was a classic debt for privilege swap that made the French financial system structurally unreformable. The situation turned terminal during the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict so expensive it pushed the French credit system to its breaking point. The treasury was so depleted that the king was forced to melt down the royal silver furniture, tons of solid silver tables, benches, and mirrors, just to pay his soldiers. It was a symbolic and literal bankruptcy. Even as the Sun King sat in the Hall of Mirrors, he was surrounded by silver furniture that was actually made of wood and paint. Did the French public realize that their invincible king was literally selling his own furniture to stay afloat? Or was the propaganda machine of Versailles strong enough to hide the truth? The internal records show a monarchy that was terrified of its own shadow, operating on a mountain of high-interest loans that could never be repaid. The financial rot reached its peak with the creation of a shadow debt system known as the extraordinary funds. When the official budget was exhausted, the king turned to private financiers, often the very people who collected his taxes, to take out secret loans at predatory rates. This created a parasitic relationship where the state was borrowing its own tax revenue from private middlemen before it was even collected. This was the ultimate realization of the luxury trap. The Sun King had built a system of such absolute power that he had no one to tell him no, and as a result, he had no one to save him from a debt that was now mathematically insurmountable. The sheer scale of the financial collapse was compounded by the king's refusal to acknowledge that the age of feudal finance was over, leading to a catastrophic mismatch between his medieval taxation methods and the modern costs of global warfare. While England was developing the Bank of England and a system of low-interest national debt backed by Parliament, Louis XIV remained dependent on a chaotic network of private tax farmers who acted as predatory middlemen between the crown and the people. These financiers, known as the traitants, would pay the king a lump sum up front for the right to collect taxes in a specific province, but they would then use brutal paramilitary methods to extract 3 or 4 times that amount from the starving peasants, pocketing the massive difference. This was a systemic leakage of national wealth, where the very mechanism of tax collection was designed to enrich a tiny circle of elite bankers at the expense of both the king and the country. Every time Louis XIII needed more money for a new fountain at Versailles or a new regiment of musketeers, he was forced to grant more power to these financiers, effectively turning the French state into a subsidiary of private interest groups. Was it possible that the Sun King, the most absolute monarch in history, was actually a puppet of the very bankers who funded his glory? The evidence lies in the secret contracts of the period, which show that by the 1690s, the king could not move his armies without the explicit permission and credit lines of a few families in Paris. This financial paralysis was further deepened by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, a decision that was not just a religious purge, but a self-inflicted economic lobotomy. By outlawing Protestantism, Louis XIV forced hundreds of thousands of Huguenots, the most skilled craftsmen, merchants, and bankers in France, to flee to his enemies in England, Holland, and Prussia. This was an unprecedented capital and talent flight, where France essentially exported its industrial future and its financial expertise to the very nations it was fighting on the battlefield. The Huguenots took with them not only their physical wealth, but their knowledge of textile manufacturing, clockmaking, and, most crucially, their international credit networks. While Versailles sparkled with gold, the French economy was being hollowed out of its middle class, leaving a gaping hole in the tax base that could never be filled. This religious obsession cost France an estimated 10% of its total industrial output, a blow that ensured the nation would remain a fragile agricultural economy while its rivals embraced the Industrial Revolution. The king's attempt to fix the crisis through monetary manipulation only served to accelerate the ruin. Between 1689 and 1715, the French crown officially devalued the currency more than 40 times, repeatedly recalling coins to melt them down and reissue them with less silver content while demanding the same face value. This was a desperate, invisible tax on every citizen, destroying the purchasing power of the poor and causing massive inflation that made basic bread unaffordable. How can a monarchy maintain its legitimacy when it is actively stealing the value of the money in its subjects' pockets? This constant tampering with the currency created a climate of financial terror, where no merchant could trust the value of the lira from one week to the next, leading to a total collapse of domestic trade. While the king's image was stamped on every coin, the trust in that image had vanished, replaced by a black market for foreign gold and a deep, simmering resentment that would eventually find its voice in the streets of Paris. The construction of Versailles also created a lethal overhead cost that the French state could not shed even in times of peace. The palace required a permanent army of 10,000 servants, soldiers, and gardeners just to function, and the cost of heating, lighting, and maintaining its miles of corridors was a permanent drain on the treasury. This was the ultimate white elephant, a monument so grand that it became a parasite on the state that built it. The king's advisors, including the legendary Colbert, had warned him that the cost of Versailles would eventually exceed the cost of his wars, but Louis XIV viewed the palace as an essential tool of political control, a stage where he could keep the rebellious nobility under his constant surveillance. The tragedy of the Sun King was that he succeeded in controlling his nobles, but in doing so, he bankrupted the very throne he was trying to protect. He had created a prison of gold for the aristocracy, but the bill for the prison was being sent to a peasantry that had nothing left to give. The debt crisis was further obscured by the total lack of a public budget. In absolute France, the king's finances were a state secret, and there was no distinction between the king's personal expenses and the expenses of the government. This allowed Louis XIV to spend millions on diamonds for his mistresses and lavish ballets, while the navy was rotting in the ports for lack of funds. The lack of transparency meant that the king himself often had no idea of the true state of his debt, as his ministers would hide the deficits through creative accounting and short-term loans from the extraordinary funds. This was a financial house of cards where the appearance of wealth was maintained only through the continuous issuance of new debt to pay off old creditors. What would happen when the last creditor finally stopped believing in the Sun King's credit? The answer would come in the final years of his reign, as the weight of the debt finally broke the back of the French financial system, leading to a moment of truth that no amount of Versailles gold could hide. The final decade of Louis XIV's reign, dominated by the brutal War of the Spanish Succession, transformed the financial crisis from a chronic illness into a terminal collapse, forcing the crown into a state of open financial warfare against its own people. The state was no longer merely borrowing, it was predatory, seizing private wealth through forced loans and the arbitrary cancellation of its own debt obligations to domestic bondholders, a move that destroyed the last vestiges of trust in the royal word. By 1708, the French treasury was so empty that the king was forced to authorize the creation of billets de monnaie, early forms of paper money that were essentially promises to pay in the future. However, because the state had no gold to back these notes, they instantly depreciated, losing 80% of their value within months and wiping out the savings of the Parisian middle class. This was a systemic liquidation of national capital, where the Sun King, in his desperate attempt to keep his armies in the field, was burning the very foundation of the French economy. The soldiers were starving, the navy was paralyzed, and yet the rituals of Versailles continued with eerie, subsidized perfection, creating a surreal contrast between the glittering Hall of Mirrors and a nation that was physically and financially breaking apart. The most catastrophic element of this period was the Great Frost of 1709, a natural disaster that acted as a multiplier for the king's financial failures. A winter so severe that even the wine froze in the king's glass at Versailles. It decimated the harvest and led to a famine that killed hundreds of thousands. In a healthy economy, the state would have intervened to buy grain from abroad, but because Louis XIV had destroyed France's credit, no foreign merchant would sell to the French crown without immediate payment in gold that the king had already spent on the war and his palaces. The famine was therefore not just a natural event, it was a direct consequence of the king's bankruptcy. The people realized that the absolute power of the king did not extend to providing bread when the treasury was empty, leading to the first widespread chants of "bread or the king's head" in the streets of Paris. a terrifying foreshadowing of 1789. How did the king respond when he realized his absolute sovereignty was being challenged by the simple physics of an empty stomach and an empty vault? He chose to double down on the image of power, ordering even more lavish festivities to project strength, while secretly instructing his ministers to seek peace at any price. The structural rot was further exposed by the rise of the nouveau riche financiers, men like Samuel Bernard, who became so powerful that they could effectively dictate terms to the king. Bernard, a Jewish-born financier who converted to Catholicism to survive at court, became the ultimate lender of last resort for the Sun King. In a famous and humiliating episode, Louis XIV was forced to personally give Bernard a tour of the gardens of Marly, a gesture of supreme royal favor, just to coax another loan from him to pay the troops. This was a symbolic death of absolutism. The Sun King was literally begging a private banker for the means to survive. This shift in power meant that the absolute monarchy was now entirely dependent on a shadow network of private capital that operated outside the law, a system of crony capitalism where the state's survival was tied to the personal profit of a few individuals. The debt was no longer a number on a ledger. It was a physical weight that had pulled the king down from his pedestal. The king's death in 1715 left a legacy that was mathematically impossible to resolve. He left behind a national debt of over 2.3 billion livres, a sum that exceeded the total tax revenue of the next 20 years. His 5-year-old successor, Louis XV, inherited a throne that was physically magnificent but financially hollowed out. The regents of the young king were so desperate to solve the debt that they turned to a Scottish adventurer named John Law, who proposed the infamous Mississippi Scheme, a plan to replace gold with paper money backed by the potential riches of the French colonies in America. This was the first great stock market bubble in history, a direct attempt to use financial alchemy to erase the Sun King's $2 trillion mistake. When the bubble inevitably burst in 1720, it wiped out what little remained of French private wealth and ensured that the French state would never again be able to borrow at reasonable rates. Did the ghost of Louis XIV's debt effectively condemn his descendants to the guillotine long before the first stone of the Bastille was moved? The trajectory from Law's failure to the 1780s suggests a direct line of financial inevitability. The ideological cost of the Sun King's bankruptcy was perhaps the most significant. The failure of the state to manage its finances led to a crisis of confidence in the very idea of absolute monarchy. Intellectuals of the Enlightenment, watching the corruption of the tax farmers and the misery of the devalued currency, began to argue that a king who cannot manage his budget has no right to manage a nation. The debt became a political weapon used by the Parlement and the rising bourgeoisie to demand a say in how their money was spent. Louis XV had built Versailles to silence the nobility, but he had inadvertently created a debt that gave a voice to the commoners. The sun had set on a bankrupt horizon, leaving a trail of unpaid bills and broken promises that would take a revolution to settle. The transition from the Sun King's personal insolvency to the institutional bankruptcy of the French state created a debt ghost that haunted the halls of Versailles for the next 3 generations, turning every subsequent attempt at royal reform into a desperate, failed negotiation with creditors. When Louis XIV died, he didn't just leave a debt. He left a culture of financial denial where the monarchy believed it could sustain its global status through prestige alone, while its underlying fiscal engine was seized by rust and corruption. The regent, Philippe d'Orléans, inherited a country where the state was spending more on interest than on the entire civilian government combined, a scenario that forced France into a permanent state of defensive imperialism. Because the crown could not afford a new war, it lost its grip on its colonies in North America and India to the British, who possessed a modern parliamentary-backed credit system that could outspend the absolute French monarchy at every turn. This was the silent global consequence of the Sun King's excesses. The loss of the first French colonial empire was not a military failure, but a foreclosure by the international markets. France was physically larger and more populous than Britain, but Britain was richer because it could borrow money at 3%, while France was forced to pay 10% to the same bankers, a sovereign risk premium that was the direct legacy of Louis XIII's repeated defaults and currency devaluations. Was the French Revolution inevitable the moment the British Navy, funded by stable debt, blockaded the French ports during the 7 Years' War? The financial data suggests that France was fighting a 20th century war with a 15th century checkbook, and the gap was filled by the blood of its citizens. The structural rot of the Sun King's tax system became a demographic time bomb during the middle of the 18th century. Because the nobility and the church, who owned over 40% of the land, remained tax-exempt as a privilege granted by Louis XIV, the entire burden of the growing national debt fell on the Third Estate, the peasants, and the rising urban bourgeoisie. This created a lethal scissors effect. As the debt grew larger, the tax base grew relatively smaller because more people were buying offices and titles to escape taxation. This led to a state of permanent rural depression, where French agriculture remained primitive because peasants had no capital left to invest in their land after the tax farmers had taken their share. While the rest of Europe was experiencing an agricultural revolution, France was stuck in a cycle of subsistence and periodic famine. The Sun King had traded the long-term food security of his nation for the short-term glitter of his court, leaving his grandsons to deal with a population that was not only poor, but increasingly radicalized by the visible injustice of the tax code. The intellectual response to this bankruptcy gave birth to the physiocrats, the world's first school of economists, who argued that France's obsession with Versailles and luxury was a parasitic drain on the only true source of wealth: the land. They pleaded with the crown to abolish the tax privileges and move toward a single tax on land. But the monarchy was so entangled in its own web of crony debt that it could not move. The king was indebted to the very nobles who held the tax exemptions. To tax them was to admit that the crown was no longer absolute. This was the absolutist paradox. The king had so much power that he had destroyed the institutions, like a parliament, that could have given his debt legitimacy. In England, the debt belonged to the nation. In France, the debt belonged to the king's body. When the king's credit died, the state died with it. What happened when the rising middle class, the lawyers and merchants of Paris, realized they were the ones actually paying for the king's mistakes without having any say in the government? This realization was the spark that turned a financial crisis into a political explosion. The ghost of the Sun King's bankruptcy also dictated France's disastrous involvement in the American Revolutionary War. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim its global standing and take revenge on Britain, the French monarchy borrowed an additional 1 billion livres to fund George Washington's armies. This was the last straw. While France won the war by humiliating Britain, the financial cost was the final nail in the coffin. By 1788, the interest on the debt alone consumed 62% of the royal budget. The Sun King's great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, was forced to do what no French king had done in 175 years: call the Estates General to ask for more money. The moment he opened that door, the debt ceased to be a secret and became a public trial of the monarchy. The revolution did not start with a demand for a republic. It started as an audit of the Sun King's unpaid bills. The ultimate lesson of Versailles is that luxury is the most expensive form of defense. Louis XIV built the palace to defend his throne against the nobles, but the debt he incurred to build it eventually destroyed the throne itself. The Sun King had created a system that was too expensive to survive and too rigid to change, proving that the most magnificent empire in the world is only as strong as its balance sheet. The gold of Versailles was not wealth. It was a gilded mortgage on the lives of 20 million Frenchmen, and the interest was finally collected in 1789. The final financial autopsy of the Sun King's legacy reveals that the French Revolution was not an accidental eruption of social unrest, but the inevitable liquidation of a bankrupt corporate state. Louis XIV had treated France as a private family estate, piling debt upon debt to finance a brand of absolute power that was structurally unsustainable in an era of rising global markets and expensive professional militaries. By the time the Bastille was stormed, the French monarchy was not just politically exhausted, but was a financial corpse being propped up by a few desperate Parisian bankers who knew that a total collapse would wipe out their own fortunes. The $2 trillion luxury trap had successfully converted the most powerful nation in Europe into a hollowed-out shell, where the gold on the walls of Versailles was the only thing of value left in a kingdom of paper debt. The transition from the Sun King to the guillotine was a direct mathematical progression. The interest payments on the 2.3 billion livres left in 1715 had compounded through decades of further wars and palace expansions until they became a black hole that swallowed the very concept of the divine right of kings. The French people didn't just want to kill a king. They wanted to cancel a debt that had enslaved their grandfathers, their fathers, and their children to a palace they were never allowed to enter. The ultimate irony of Louis XIV's reign is that the very palace he built to centralize his power became the catalyst for its total destruction. Versailles acted as a physical barrier between the crown and the economic reality of the nation, allowing the king and his court to live in a permanent state of subsidized delusion, while the rest of France was being crushed by the weight of the tile and the gabelle. This geographic and financial isolation meant that the monarchy lost the ability to respond to the changing world, clinging to feudal privileges and tax exemptions that were fundamentally incompatible with a modern state. The Sun King's mistake was thinking that wealth could be commanded into existence through decree and prestige rather than fostered through industry and trade. He spent the nation's capital on marble instead of machinery, on lace instead of laboratories, and on glory instead of grain. When the final crisis came in 1789, the state found that it had plenty of mirrors but no money, plenty of courtiers but no credit, and plenty of history but no future. The absolute power of the king was revealed to be a fragile illusion that vanished the moment the bankers stopped writing checks. The $2 trillion bankruptcy of the Sun King stands as a timeless warning to any superpower that believes its prestige is a substitute for its solvency. It proves that the most magnificent architecture and the most powerful army in the world cannot save a regime that has lost its financial foundation. The debt was the silent, invisible fire that burned through the floorboards of Versailles for a century before the house finally collapsed. The Sun King achieved his goal of becoming the center of the world, but he did so by mortgaging the very light he claimed to provide, ensuring that when the sun finally set on his dynasty, it would set in a sea of red ink and revolution. The legacy of the Sun King is not found in the mirrors of Versailles, but in the ledger of the National Assembly, where the people finally took control of the purse strings that the king had so disastrously unraveled. The bankruptcy was complete, the liquidation was violent, and the world was forever changed by the day the Sun King's bills finally came due. This investigation has proved definitively that the fall of the French monarchy was a financial execution carried out over a century, triggered by the luxury trap of Versailles and the endless wars of Louis XIV. The power of an absolute king is nothing compared to the power of a compound interest rate on a bankrupt treasury. The financial details of this story are now fully revealed, but the final judgment rests with you. What do you think? Was the fall of the French monarchy a failure of individual character, or was it the inevitable result of a financial system designed to protect the rich while bankrupting the poor? Comment below and share your thoughts on the $2 trillion mistake that changed history.